What would you do if a gate agent ripped your passport in half, right in front of everyone? Airports have a strange way of making you feel small. No matter who you are or what title you carry, once you walk into those glass doors, you're just another traveler with a bag, a ticket, and a destination. That morning in Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, the air felt heavy with the kind of stress only a crowded terminal can bring. Voices layered over one another, luggage wheels clicked across the floor, and announcements crackled over the loudspeaker in bursts no one could fully understand. Among the hundreds of faces moving through security and rushing to their gates was Melissa Carter. She wasn't the type to make a scene or demand attention. Her posture was calm, shoulders squared, and her dark blazer gave away the fact that she was traveling for business, not leisure. She carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and why you're there. To everyone else, she looked like just another young professional trying to make her flight on time. Melissa paused for a moment, pulling her rolling suitcase closer as she checked the digital board overhead. Flight 762 to Charlotte, on time. Good. She had a connecting flight from there to Washington, D.C., where she was scheduled to meet with federal officials later that evening. It wasn't a trip she could afford to miss. She stepped into line at gate C-14, adjusting her carry-on strap while the line moved forward at an agonizingly slow pace. Families wrestled with strollers, a couple argued quietly about whether they should have packed more snacks, and an older man ahead of her fumbled with his boarding pass as though it were written in another language. Melissa exhaled, patient, waiting her turn. Finally, she reached the counter. The gate agent glanced up without much interest. Her name tag read J. Burns. She was middle-aged, hair pulled back tightly, her uniform blazer buttoned a little too high, her expression set in a kind of permanent disapproval. The kind of person who made you feel like you were already a problem before you even opened your mouth. Melissa offered a polite smile. "Good morning. I just wanted to check. Can you confirm if my seat is still together with my checked baggage? I had a connecting flight added last night." Janet Burns looked up, barely moving her lips when she spoke. "Flight number?" Melissa slid her passport across the counter with her boarding pass. "Flight 762 to Charlotte." Burns typed something on her keyboard, each keystroke sharp and deliberate. She sighed, then muttered, "You people always wait until the last second." Her voice was quiet, but not quiet enough. Melissa blinked. "Excuse me?" Burns didn't look up. "I said people always wait until the last second to ask questions like this. Slows everything down." Melissa's lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't the type to react right away. Years of professionalism taught her how to keep composure even when provoked. "I asked because I wanted to make sure everything was in order. I have a connection to catch." Burns stopped typing, looked directly at her, and for the first time, there was something sharper than irritation in her expression. "And I have 100 people to get on this plane. Do you want me to babysit your itinerary, or do you want to move along?" A couple of passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to listen, but clearly catching every word. Melissa stood still, debating whether to push back or let it go. The tension was already thick, but something told her this was only the beginning. But the real storm hadn't even started yet, because in the next few minutes, this simple exchange would spiral into something no one at gate C-14 would ever forget. Melissa leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough so that it wouldn't carry through the waiting area. "I'm not trying to make things harder for you," she said. "I just need confirmation that my connection is linked to my bag." That's all. Burns didn't budge. She slid Melissa's passport back across the counter without so much as a glance upward. "It's fine." Next, the word hit like a dismissal, final and cold. Melissa kept her hand on the counter, refusing to step aside. A couple behind her exchanged looks, whispering something to each other. "Ma'am," Melissa said firmly now, "I didn't hear a confirmation. Can you please check?" Burns tilted her head back, exhaling loudly, as if Melissa had asked her to solve world hunger. "Look, I told you it's fine. Why don't you trust me and keep the line moving?" Melissa narrowed her eyes. "Because it's important. If I miss my bag in Charlotte, I'll be delayed in D.C. I have a federal meeting tonight. This isn't optional." That word, federal, made Burns pause, but only for a second. Then she smirked, leaning closer over the counter. "You know, people like you come through here all the time thinking you're the most important person in the room. Guess what? You're not. You're just another traveler with a boarding pass. Nothing more." The passengers in line went silent, The hum of the terminal seemed to dull as more heads turned toward the counter. Melissa could feel their eyes on her back, strangers waiting to see what she'd do. Melissa kept her tone even. I didn't say I was more important. I said I need confirmation, and I think I'm entitled to that as a paying passenger. Burns let out a short, bitter laugh. Entitled? Oh, you're definitely entitled. I can see it all over you. The words dripped with venom, each one carefully chosen to sting. Melissa's jaw tightened, though she forced herself to keep her composure. Years of experience had taught her that reacting in anger rarely worked in her favor. Still, she couldn't just walk away. She leaned slightly closer. All I'm asking for is professionalism. That's it. Do your job, and I'll move on. For a split second, something flickered in Burns's eyes, something between anger and defiance. Then she snatched Melissa's passport off the counter with a sudden movement that made the people standing closest flinch. Professionalism? Burns repeated, her voice sharp. You want professionalism? Let me show you how we handle difficult passengers. Melissa's stomach dropped, though her face betrayed nothing. She glanced quickly at the crowd, dozens of witnesses, phones already starting to rise in curious hands. A man standing a few feet away whispered to his wife, Is she really talking to her like that? Melissa spoke again, slower now, every word deliberate. Be very careful what you're about to do, because you don't know who you're dealing with. Burns narrowed her eyes, gripping the passport so tightly the edges bent under her fingers. She leaned forward until only a few inches separated her face from Melissa's. Oh, I think I know exactly who I'm dealing with. Just another passenger who thinks the rules don't apply to her. The tension hung heavy, thick enough that even the children waiting nearby had gone quiet. Everyone sensed it, something was about to snap. But no one expected the way it would happen, or just how far Janet Burns was willing to go to prove her point. Melissa tried to stay grounded, but her pulse was pounding in her ears. The small rectangle of navy blue in Burns's hand wasn't just a booklet. It was her identity, her freedom to move, her link to the important work she had waiting in Washington. Hand it back, Melissa said quietly, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that made a few heads turn. Burns raised her eyebrows in mock surprise. Excuse me? You don't give me orders. I'm the one in charge here. Melissa's eyes locked onto hers. You're in charge of checking tickets. That's it. You don't own me, and you don't own my passport. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A man holding his phone at chest level was definitely recording now. A teenager whispered, Yo, this is crazy, to his friend. Burns tilted her chin up, her grip tightening around the passport. You're holding up this entire line. Everyone else just hands me their documents, smiles, and moves along. Why can't you do the same? Melissa's voice sharpened. Because you're not treating me with the same respect you're giving everyone else. And I'm not going to shrink myself to make you feel comfortable. That answer hit harder than Melissa expected. Burns's face reddened, her lips pressing into a thin, hard line. She stepped back, then turned slightly so her voice projected to the crowd waiting behind Melissa. You see this? This is what I deal with all day. People making demands, thinking they're special, slowing everything down for the rest of you. The crowd stirred. A woman with a stroller called out, She's not asking for anything crazy. Just give her the passport back. Burns ignored her, eyes still locked on Melissa. You think you're clever, don't you? Coming here with your fancy blazer, throwing around the word federal like it means something. Let me tell you, your job title doesn't mean a thing at this counter. Here, I decide what happens. Melissa could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she kept her tone steady. And when this is over, you're going to regret treating people this way. Not because of who I am, but because it's wrong. Burns let out a sharp laugh. Spare me the speech. People like you always play the victim. That sentence, the way she said people like you, shifted the entire atmosphere. Gasps escaped from the crowd. A man in a baseball cap muttered under his breath, That's crossing the line. Another passenger said louder, You can't talk to her like that. Melissa stood tall, refusing to look away. You've shown everyone here who you are, but I'm not going to stoop to your level. Burns leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough that only Melissa and the front row could hear. You think these people are on your side? Wait until you miss your flight. Nobody will care. Melissa felt her stomach twist, but her eyes never wavered. I care. And that's enough to stand here and call this what it is: unprofessional, discriminatory, and unacceptable. For a split second, Burns's expression faltered. Then her lips curled into something closer to defiance than doubt. She held the passport higher, letting everyone see it. "If you don't move along," she said, her voice rising again, "you're not boarding this flight at all." Gasps echoed through the waiting area. Melissa inhaled slowly, steadying herself. But what came next would take the room from tense silence to outright shock in less than a heartbeat. The air in Gate C-14 was so tight with tension, you could almost feel it pressing down on your shoulders. Melissa stood still, her suitcase by her side, her face calm, but her eyes fixed on the small Navy book in Janet Burns's hand. The crowd had grown restless. Some were filming, some whispering, others just staring, unable to look away. "Last chance," Melissa said firmly, her voice carrying clearly this time. "Return my passport." Burns's lips twisted into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Or what? You going to call your federal meeting and complain that someone dared to stand up to you?" Melissa shook her head. "This isn't about me. It's about you crossing a line you can't uncross." Burns tapped the passport against the counter, her nails clicking against the cover. She seemed to savor the attention, as if the eyes of the waiting passengers were feeding her resolve. "You think you can scare me with your calm little speeches?" she said, her tone mocking. "I've worked this job for 15 years. I've dealt with louder, pushier, ruder people than you. And you know what? I always win." Melissa leaned slightly forward. "Winning isn't humiliating people. It's doing your job with respect." The smirk faded just a bit from Burns's face, but then she made her move. In one swift, deliberate motion, she opened the passport, gripped the edge of the page, and tore it straight down the middle. The sound of paper ripping sliced through the air, louder than any announcement on the intercom. Gasps erupted from every corner of the gate. A woman cried out, "Oh my God!" A man shouted, "She just destroyed her passport!" Melissa froze, her body rigid, her eyes locked on the shredded pieces now dangling in Burns's hands. For a second, time seemed to stand still. She could hear a child start to whimper in the background, the squeak of a suitcase handle being dropped, the whisper of someone saying, "Is this real?" Burns held the torn halves up triumphantly, as though she'd just proven some unspoken point. "There," she said, her voice raised. "Now you have nothing to hold over me." "How's that for professionalism?" Melissa's chest rose and fell, her breathing steady but sharp. She didn't move, didn't blink. "You just destroyed federal property," she said slowly, every word clear. "Do you realize what you've done?" Burns shrugged, tossing the pieces onto the counter as if they were trash. "I see a passenger with no valid documents, which means you're not boarding this plane. Next in line." But no one moved. The line had dissolved into stunned silence, every eye fixed on the counter. Phones were held higher now, recording every second. Someone whispered, "She's finished." "She has to be finished." Melissa finally reached forward, picking up the torn halves of her passport carefully, as though they were something fragile and sacred. She held them together, the gold crest broken, but still recognizable. "This is beyond you, Ms. Burns," she said softly, her voice calm but resolute. "You've crossed into something you can't take back." Burns rolled her eyes. "Oh, spare me. You'll file a complaint, they'll give me a slap on the wrist, and I'll be right back here tomorrow. That's how it works." But even as she said it, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. Because the room hadn't turned on Melissa. The room had turned on her. From the back, a voice rang out clear and sharp. "I've got this all on video." She destroyed her passport in front of everyone. Burns's eyes darted toward the sound, then back to Melissa. Her confidence wavered for the first time. Melissa didn't raise her voice, but when she spoke, the authority in her tone was undeniable. "You just made a very big mistake." But Janet Burns still had no idea just how big that mistake really was, or who she had just tried to humiliate. The silence that followed was short-lived. Within seconds, voices rose around the gate like a sudden storm. "She can't do that," someone shouted. "That's illegal," another added. Melissa stood steady, the torn passport still in her hands. She didn't move, but her presence seemed to grow larger, stronger, as the chaos around her built. People weren't whispering anymore. They were demanding answers. A young woman in a denim jacket pointed directly at Burns. I got the whole thing recorded. Every second. You're done. Burns' composure cracked for the first time. She glanced quickly at the phones aimed at her, then back at Melissa. Her voice was shaky, though she tried to cover it with anger. Everyone calm down. She was being disruptive. I was following procedure. That lie landed flat. A man near the front of the line snapped, Procedure? Since when does procedure mean destroying someone's passport? Another woman added, You tore it in half in front of us. You can't spin that. Melissa finally spoke, her voice calm, deliberate, and loud enough for the crowd. She just destroyed an official government document. That's not only unprofessional, it's a federal offense. Gasps rippled again. The gravity of those words hung in the air, and even Burns flinched slightly. A TSA officer stationed a few gates down noticed the commotion and hurried over, his walkie-talkie already in his hand. What's going on here? He demanded, eyes darting between the crowd and the counter. Several passengers spoke at once. She ripped her passport. She's discriminating against her. I have it on video, want to see? The officer looked overwhelmed, but he turned to Melissa first. Ma'am, are you okay? Melissa lifted the torn halves slightly. My passport has been destroyed by this agent. In front of witnesses. The officer's face tightened. He turned sharply to Burns. Is this true? Burns crossed her arms, defensive. She was being difficult. She wouldn't follow instructions. I had to. You had to what? The officer cut in, incredulous. You had to destroy her passport? Are you kidding me? The crowd erupted in agreement, voices overlapping. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Melissa wasn't alone anymore. She had dozens of strangers standing behind her, outraged on her behalf. Burns's face reddened, but she tried to regain control. You all don't understand. She was trying to intimidate me, throwing around her status like she was above the rules. Melissa's eyes narrowed, but her tone stayed level. I never once said I was above the rules. I asked a routine question and expected a professional answer. What you did wasn't about rules, it was about control. The officer's radio crackled. More security personnel were on their way. The tension in Burns's posture grew heavier by the second. Meanwhile, several passengers stepped closer to Melissa, offering quiet support. Don't worry, I saw everything, one man said. I'll give a statement if they need it. Me too, added the woman with the stroller. She targeted you, plain and simple. Melissa nodded gratefully, her composure unshaken. She glanced at Burns one last time. You wanted everyone here to see me as the problem. But now they've all seen the truth. Burns opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat as two uniformed airport security officers arrived. One of them gestured toward the small office behind the counter. Ma'am, we're going to need to speak with you. Now Burns looked like she wanted to argue, but with dozens of cameras still pointed her way, she had no choice. She straightened her blazer and walked stiffly toward the office, her face pale and tight. Melissa stood tall, the torn passport still in her hands, the crowd parting around her like she was the center of something much larger than one argument. But what the crowd didn't yet know was that Melissa's story wasn't ending here. It was only just beginning, because her real identity was about to change everything. The gate had quieted, though the weight of what just happened still lingered like static in the air. Melissa remained at the counter, the torn passport in her hands, her face calm, but unreadable. Security had led Janet Burns into the small office behind the gate, but her absence didn't erase the moment. If anything, it made the tension sharper. One of the security officers turned to Melissa. Ma'am, can you come with us too? We'll need to take your statement. Melissa nodded. Of course. She slid the torn halves of her passport into a folder she carried and lifted her bag, walking with quiet authority past the rows of passengers still watching. The office was small, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, a desk separating the officers from where Melissa sat. Burns was already there, red-faced, arms crossed tightly. She avoided eye contact. The lead officer cleared his throat. Miss Carter, we understand your passport was damaged by this agent. Is that correct? Melissa laid the pieces on the desk carefully, like evidence. Not just damaged. Destroyed, by her own hand in front of dozens of witnesses, many of whom recorded the incident. Burns scoffed, her voice sharp. You make it sound like I committed a crime. I was trying to enforce order. Melissa finally turned toward her, eyes steady. You didn't enforce order. You abused your position. The room went still. The officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure how far this situation was about to escalate. Melissa reached into her bag and produced another folder, this one stamped with the seal of the Federal Aviation Administration. She set it on the desk slowly, deliberately, then looked at each person in the room. My name is Melissa Carter, Chief Inspector, FAA. I oversee compliance and enforcement at major airports across the country, including this one. The words landed like a hammer. The officers straightened instinctively, their expression shifting from routine procedure to something closer to alarm. Even Burns, who had been clinging to her defiance, blinked rapidly, her face draining of color. That's impossible, Burns muttered, though her voice cracked. You're just saying that to... Melissa opened the folder and slid her credentials across the desk. Verify them. Call the number on the back if you doubt me. I'll wait. The lead officer hesitated only a moment before lifting the badge and examining it closely. His eyes widened slightly. He handed it back with both hands. She's telling the truth. Burns shifted in her seat, her arms tightening around herself. You didn't say... Melissa cut her off. I didn't need to. I came here as a passenger, just like anyone else. How you treated me wasn't about who I am. It was about who you are. The second officer leaned forward. Miss Carter, we'll escalate this immediately. Do you want to press charges? Melissa held the torn passport in her hands again. The gold crest split in two. She looked at Burns for a long moment, then back at the officers. This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring no passenger has to experience what I just did. File the report. Forward it to federal investigators. I'll be following up personally. Burns's lips parted, but no words came out. She sank back into her chair, her earlier bravado completely gone. Melissa stood, gathering her things. I have a meeting in D.C. tonight. I need emergency clearance and a temporary document issued immediately. Please make that happen. The officers nodded quickly, almost tripping over themselves to comply. But Melissa knew this was only the start. The real consequences for Janet Burns were still to come, and they would be far more serious than anything she'd ever imagined. By the time Melissa left the office, her emergency clearance already in motion, the airport had transformed into something else entirely. What began as a confrontation at a gate had turned into a full-blown spectacle. Dozens of passengers were still huddled around, swapping stories, showing each other clips they'd just recorded. The incident had already leapt beyond the walls of Gate C-14. Videos were being uploaded to social media at lightning speed, captions filled with disbelief and anger. One clip captured the moment Burns ripped the passport, the sound of paper tearing amplified by the gasps that followed. Another showed Melissa's steady composure as she confronted the agent, contrasted with Burns' sneering dismissals. Hashtags were forming in real time. #PassportGate. Accountability at airports. By the time Melissa was escorted to a private lounge to wait for her travel documents, her name was already trending. Meanwhile, in the small office, Burns sat stiffly across from the airport's station manager who had been called in to deal with the fallout. Her earlier confidence was gone, replaced with a shaky defensiveness. I was under pressure, she argued, her voice cracking. She was provoking me, making demands. I lost patience. The station manager pinched the bridge of his nose. You destroyed a U.S. passport, in front of witnesses. Do you understand how serious this is? Burns's mouth opened, then shut again. She had no real defense. The image of the crowd, their phones lifted high, was seared into her memory. No amount of excuses could erase that moment. Back in the lounge, Melissa sat with her phone buzzing non-stop. Colleagues, reporters, even acquaintances she hadn't spoken to in years were reaching out. She ignored most of it, keeping her focus on the task at hand. She sent one email to her office in D.C. detailing the incident, attaching the first few clips that passengers had already shared with her. Her message was clear. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was a systemic issue that demanded immediate attention. By the evening, the story had broken nationwide. News outlets ran headlines like, Gate Agent Destroys Passenger's Passport in Public Meltdown and Passenger. Turns out to be FAA's Chief Inspector. On live broadcasts, pundits debated how such a blatant abuse of power could happen in a place meant to serve the public. Burns's name and face were everywhere. The video had been replayed millions of times, dissected frame by frame. Public outrage poured in from every direction. Some called for her firing, others for criminal charges. The FAA released a brief statement confirming that the incident was under investigation and that the chief inspector had not missed her federal meeting. For Burns, the walls closed in fast. She was placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. Her supervisor told her bluntly that the chances of returning to her post were slim. Lawyers began circling, some representing passengers who felt traumatized by witnessing the scene. Melissa, meanwhile, carried on with her responsibilities. She didn't gloat, didn't feed the media frenzy. At her meeting in D.C., she addressed the situation only briefly, framing it not as a personal attack, but as an opportunity to re-examine how frontline staff are trained and held accountable. "This wasn't about me," she told the room of officials. "It was about how everyday people are treated when they travel. If this could happen to me, someone with oversight authority, imagine how often it happens to those with no platform, no cameras around, no one to back them up." Her words carried weight. Policies began shifting almost immediately. Emergency directives were drafted to review gate agent training nationwide, with emphasis on accountability and respect for passengers. Burns, sitting at home watching the coverage, realized the scale of what she'd done. She hadn't just lost her temper. She'd destroyed her career, humiliated herself publicly, and sparked reforms she never intended. But Melissa wasn't finished. Not until she made sure the lesson reached beyond one gate, one airport, one agent. The real message was still to come. A week after the incident at Gate C-14, Melissa sat quietly in her office overlooking the skyline of Washington, D.C. Her desk was covered in reports, policy drafts, and transcripts of interviews from passengers who had witnessed the confrontation. The story hadn't died down, it had grown, sparking conversations across the country about respect, accountability, and the quiet ways authority can be abused. She thought back to that moment, standing in line like any other traveler, asking a simple question, only to be met with hostility and humiliation. It wasn't about her title. It wasn't about the blazer she wore or the destination she was headed to. It was about the principle, about dignity. And dignity, she believed, was something no one should have to earn. It was something everyone deserved, regardless of who they were. Burns's career had effectively ended. Official investigations confirmed what the videos already proved. She had destroyed a federal document and treated a passenger in a way that violated not only company policy, but also federal law. She faced charges, fines, and a level of public scrutiny she could never escape. But for Melissa, it wasn't just about punishment. It was about progress. In her meetings with federal agencies and airline executives, she pushed for reforms, mandatory training on de-escalation, stricter oversight of gate agents, and clearer avenues for passengers to file grievances without fear of retaliation. For her, the goal was simple. No one should ever feel powerless in a place meant to serve them. Late one evening, she recorded a message that would later be shared with airline staff nationwide. Sitting at her desk, her voice was steady, her gaze direct. What happened at Phoenix wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection of what happens when people forget that authority comes with responsibility. Respect is not optional. It is the foundation of safety, trust, and service. If we cannot protect the dignity of those we serve, we fail in our duty, and that will never be acceptable. The video struck a chord. Employees across the country discussed it in break rooms and training sessions. Passengers shared it online, saying it captured exactly what they had felt, but rarely heard, acknowledged out loud. Melissa never sought fame, but her name became attached to something bigger than herself. A reminder that silence in the face of mistreatment only allows it to spread. And as for the passengers who had stood with her that day, many later said the same thing. What stayed with them wasn't just the injustice they witnessed, but the way Melissa carried herself, calm, clear, firm. She didn't need to shout to show strength. She didn't need to retaliate to prove power. She simply stood in her truth, and that was enough. As she prepared for another flight weeks later, Melissa paused in the terminal. She looked at the lines of tired travelers, parents juggling strollers, business people tapping at laptops, young students clutching backpacks, and thought about how fragile trust could be. One action, one word, one abuse of power could shatter it. But one act of courage could also restore it. She whispered to herself, not for anyone else to hear, respect people, and the world changes. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. Not everyone carries a title, not everyone has cameras watching, but everyone has dignity. And the way we treat people in the smallest of moments, at a counter, in a line, in a place as ordinary as an airport, can define who we are more than any badge or uniform ever could. So here's the call to you. If you see injustice, speak up. If you're given authority, wield it with care. And if you're ever treated unfairly, remember, your worth is not decided by someone else's bad judgment. Because dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right. And when we protect it, we protect each other.